This is a lesson to explore different levels of significance. This is for Paper 2, AQA Psychology. So, we're now looking at inferential statistics and why and when you would use different levels of significance. So, how do we use inferential tests? First of all, we need to introduce the concepts. You need to know the idea of probability. On an exam paper, this will appear as a small p equals and then a number. This is the probability. You also need to be aware of levels of significance. Type 1 and Type 2 errors, observed or calculated values, and critical values. Make sure that you're aware of what each of these are. So, what does probability mean, first of all? You'd never be asked a question like this, but this is just to help you understand the idea of why we use probability in statistical tests. So, probability is the likelihood that something will happen. So, obviously, the closer it is to 100%, the more likely it is to happen. This is how probability is calculated. You aren't required for AQA to calculate probability, but if you want to have a look at this to refresh yourself, this would help you in case you're asked to convert fractions into decimals. You could potentially be asked a question where you're asked to convert fractions into decimals or decimals into fractions. Have a look and see if you can express the following probabilities. So the likelihood of tossing a coin and it landing on tails is 1/2, 50%, or 0.5. Remember in the exam to always make a fraction as small as possible. The likelihood of rolling a 6 on a dice is 1/6. This would be 16.7% or 0.167. Again, try to express a fraction as low as possible. The likelihood of rolling 2 6s on 2 die would be 1/6 times 1/6 equals 1 out of 36. This would be 2.7% or 0.027. Again, notice the 3 ways that AQA want you to use numbers: fractions, percentages, or decimals. So, psychologists are interested to see if their data analysis is due to chance. Usually, we predict the likelihood of an outcome but in psychology, we work out how likely it is that the chance has affected our results. So, probability, or P in science, is expressed as a value between 0 and 1. So if we have a look at these probabilities, consider how likely they are that the results were due to chance. Which is the most likely, which is the least likely, and which is the most certain. So if we look at these, 0.95 is the least significant. It is the closest to 1. There is a higher likelihood that the results were due to chance. So we move on to significance. What does significant mean? This is the level at which we can reject the null hypothesis and accept our experimental or alternative hypothesis. Scientists try to generalise from the sample to the target population. But the reason that we use inferential statistical tests is to identify how likely it is that the results from our sample accurately reflect what would happen in the population. So we need to get this as accurate as possible. A statistical test tells us how probable something actually is. So a hypothesis is a testable statement. We're going to consider the idea that a study is carried out to test whether gender influences levels of aggression. So you could be asked something like this in the exam and be asked to generate a directional or a non-directional hypothesis from this. Make sure that you can write the experimental hypothesis and the null hypothesis for this in your own words. So an experimental hypothesis would be males will be more aggressive than females. Females will be less aggressive than males. Or it could be there will be no difference in gender and levels of aggression. So statistical tests give us an idea of whether the results are probable or likely in the wider population. If this probability is small enough, it suggests that results in our sample are unlikely to be due to chance, and we can therefore infer that the results reflect the population, and we can reject the null hypothesis. So, the level of significance always used in psychology is 0.05 or 5%. If the exam paper does not tell you otherwise, this is what you are to use. You need to know why this is the case, and you should know this already from looking through your notes. So therefore P equals 0.05, and this is the likelihood of getting the findings if the null hypothesis is true. So, psychologists have concluded that for most purposes the 5% level of significance will be used. Remember that 5% equals 0.05. This means that we are 95% certain of our results, and that there is a 5% chance that our results have occurred due to error or chance. A result that is significant at this level can be said to be less than 5% likely to be to chance, a 1 in 20 chance of being a fluke. Have a look at these and consider which of these would be significant. Which would be the most significant? So, what does P equals 0.05 mean? And explain why the 0.05 level of significance is normally used in psychology. This next part you need to remember. You need to learn this. You need to rote learn this. P equals 0.05 is a balance between 0.01 and 0.10. 0.01 is used with medical trials where there is a matter of life or death. 0.10 is where significance is not high. We only need a 90% certainty. Also, 0.05 is the normal level of significance in psychology because it strikes a balance between type 1 and type 2 errors. These 2 points you need to commit to memory and ensure that if you're asked a question as to why do we use the 5% level or the 0.05, this completes the answer that you will be able to give. Type 1 and type 2 errors. There's no easy way of remembering this, but a type 1 error is when the null hypothesis is rejected when it's actually true. A type 2 error is when the null hypothesis is accepted when it is not true. Again, you need to remember these. So, the key points from this session. Probability is a measure of how likely something is to happen. Statistics are used to test the probability that the null hypothesis is true. The null hypothesis is that there will be no relationship or difference between variables in the population. If the probability of the null hypothesis being correct is lower than the level of significance, then it can be rejected. Ensure that you can answer these questions. What is meant by significance level? This is how certain we are of our results. What significance level is usually set in psychology is 5% or 0.05. What is meant by an observed value, often referred to as the calculated value? This is the value that you get when you've carried out an inferential test, such as a Wilcoxon or a Mann-Whitney. What is meant by the critical value? This is the value on the table. What does P equals 0.05 mean? This means that we are 95% certain of our results. This ends the session on significance and probability.